I know in the tease of my last episode I told you we would talk about packing, and I don't have the gear in really to talk about that just yet, waiting for it to arrive. But I have had a lot of attention as far as my photography is concerned while I'm on the road, so I thought I would cut a quick episode for tips and tricks for Pics. For this episode, I wanted to get into three things, basically, as far as my photography is concerned, and your photography as well. One is the kit that I use to create the images that I create. The second one is getting into a few compositional tips that way, how to go through and compose and use other resources that you have at hand. And third, I want to get into some post-processing tips, nothing really deep, because there's a lot of apps out there that can go through and help you out. But those three things there that I want to get into. And the first thing I want to get into is the gear, is what I'm talking about here. And what I use all fits inside this this little case. In fact, the main thing that I use is what's shooting me right now, and that's my iPhone 8. I use that with an app called Camera Plus, and between the camera and that app, I acquire most of my stuff. They say the best camera is the camera that you have with you all the time, and this is the camera that I have with me most of the time. When I want to get a little bit more creative and technical and have a little bit more control over exposure and depth of field and those kinds of things, then this is on the ride with me as well. And what I have in here is a digital single lens reflex camera. It's a mirrorless camera, and I'll get into that here in just a minute. But I wanted to show you the case. A lot of people are worried about taking their expensive gear out with them, putting it in the panniers. This case is made by Lowepro. It's their SH120. It's an all-weather case there. It's not obviously waterproof that way, but what I like about it is it has a zipper that goes around the whole perimeter of the opening, and it's all very well padded, not necessarily shockproof, but you know what? In all the miles that I've traveled with this thing, I've never had an incident as far as any of the gear that I keep in here. And I don't keep a lot of gear in here. I'm trying to keep this down to as minimal as I can to get the most maximum flexibility out of my photography that I can. And the first thing that allows me to do that is the camera body itself. And that camera body is this. It's made by Fujifilm, and it's the XM1. This camera, though, is no longer on the market. It's not made anymore. What I really like about this, obviously, is its compact size. A lot of people ask me, though, why do I shoot Fujifilm? I used to shoot Nikon professionally, and I shot Canon professionally. And while they were great cameras, especially back in the day when we were shooting film, when I was shooting film, I was shooting Fujifilm. I was shooting Fujichrome. They're Velvia and Provia stocks for the most part. And when Fuji developed their single lens reflex camera, their DSLR, they created a color algorithm within the camera that goes through and reproduces the emulsion quality of those two films. And so that's why I switched over to this. Besides the fact they're outstanding cameras, this has a full metal chassis in it. I have a grip that I have added to it because the camera is actually so small that I had a hard time holding on to it, especially if I have a large lens on it like what I have on here. Speaking of lenses, then this is a 16 to 55 millimeter zoom lens. And as you can see, it's a 2.8. And if you know anything about apertures, you know that this was what's called a fast lens, meaning it lets in a lot of light. Now, this is more expensive than a kit lens. In fact, it's a lot more expensive. But that price pays off for me with the images that I'm able to go through and take with it. 16 millimeters is just wide enough for me to go through and do some really nice landscape work, while 55 millimeter gives me telephoto enough to go through and at least build some compression into my shots with what I want. So this does it all really for me in about every kind of situation that I end up shooting in. If I do want a little bit more light as to work with, I have this little Camlin. It's a 50 millimeter 1.1. It's a very fast lens, and this gives me the kind of really shallow depth of field that I want to work if I'm working in kind of detail shots, kind of macro-esque product shots, that kind of thing. I love this lens. It's relatively inexpensive for a fast lens, for a 1.1. You can pick them up on Amazon for about $250. For a comparable lens like this that was made by a manufacturer, you'd be into the thousands of dollars for that. So the glass is good. I've gone through and looked at detail with it, and you know, for all intents and purposes, it works just fine for me. The same that I can say about my camera. I don't need a full chip or full frame pickup in there, because I'm really not blowing anything up or going that huge with the kinds of photography that I'm doing. It's mostly for online, for internet, or for YouTube that I'm putting up there. So that's the kit. That's what I'm using to go through and shoot with, along with my iPhone. Let's talk about composition. The first thing I want to get into deals with our perspective as a photographer, as a storyteller. Where are we as we're looking at the bike, the campsite, the vista, the beautiful view, whatever that case might be, and how can we go through and maybe have that become more significant to us? And one of the things we can do is break away from what I call the 5-7 syndrome. That is, most of us are standing up, we go through and put a camera up to our eye and we take a picture. And we take a picture at the level that we're seeing everything. But if you can get below that or above that, get around that in a way that sees things in a different perspective, it might help you out. For example, I took a shot where I'm standing up completely, looking out over that edge of the Great Salt Lake. And then I brought the camera down just a little bit and made the tiger just a little bit more pronounced in the frame. And look at the difference it makes with that. It's just a little bit more powerful. Besides varying your perspective, you can also go through and vary your focal length. And you can do that with a zoom lens. You can do that with an iPhone 11 Pro. It has 3 lenses on it, a wide angle is standard, and a telephoto lens that lets you get into some kind of compression there. There's a couple images here that I want to show you that kind of go through and illustrate this. The first one is actually a telephoto shot, and even though it looks wide, the telephoto aspect of this goes through and compresses the image. So you have these big boulders and the cement blocks, kind of foreground. Middle ground is where the tiger is parked, and then behind that you have the image of the Great Salt Lake and then the island that's behind there. And that goes through and compresses everything together. Now within that compression though, I wanted some room for the eye to move through the frame. So I backed off. I backed off my own film plane there to go through and actually release the shutter. On this next one, the bike never moved. In fact, if you compare the two and take a look at them, my line of sight's pretty well the same as well, but I changed lenses. I went with a 14mm wide angle lens on this and walked right up to the motorcycle to go through and release a shutter. Now here you see the depth that's being created with this. Everything's far away, as opposed to the compression that we saw in the telephoto photo that I showed you before. So 2 examples here of what focal length can do for you to give you some variety as far as your storytelling is concerned. So the rule of thirds is a pretty straightforward compositional influence that a lot of photographers use, and it helps to go through and tell a story in terms of how we're making the eye move throughout the frame. And what it looks like is a tic-tac-toe grid that goes over your frame. And the concept with this is where those vertical and horizontal lines bisect, that's a place to go through and put your main subject of action that's happening within your image. For example, I have this shot here. So if you notice, the bike itself, it shows up on the bottom right-hand intersection of that rule of thirds. And then you see the horizon line, the top line there, also kind of matches the horizon that I'm looking at as far as the whole composition is concerned this way. This goes through and makes it a lot more pleasing to the eye as far as composition is concerned. So here, the motorcycle's down on the grid on the lower left-hand side where they go through and intersect, and then you can see the horizons reaching there as well. There's also a line that's swooping through this as far as a road goes, and it turns into that train that you're seeing in the distance. And the motorcycle's proximity and its vector pointing into the frame gives this some kind of a feeling of, okay, let's go, right? As opposed to it being more relaxed on the other side of the frame. In this shot, the motorcycle falls on the top right, kind of between the top right and the bottom right intersections there. And I created a lead room here because I wanted to have a graphic fall within that negative space that you're seeing within that. So pretty straightforward tips there as far as how to go through maybe and to improve your storytelling as far as your changing your perspective, using different focal lengths, and using the rule of thirds. The last thing you can get into that will go through and start enhancing what it is that you're trying to say with your images is what you're doing in post-production. And most folks don't do this. They like what they see and they'll go through and upload it from that point instead of taking one more step to go through and maybe pull out a little bit more detail out of shadows, or to go through and saturate a little bit more as far as color is concerned, or create a little bit more detail and make something a little bit more sharper. And there are lots of apps that are out there. Camera Plus makes one for iPhone that is one that I've been using for years now. It's my go-to app for a lot of the things that I do. And what I use it for is this concept of clarity, which turns my images basically into a high dynamic range image. I get a lot of exposure value in my shadows and in my highlights at the same time. And we have a tendency to kind of really like that. If you have a Mac, it bundles with Photo. It used to be called iPhoto, now it's just called Photo, but it has all kinds of tools in there to go through and post-produce your images. There's lots of stuff that you can load onto a tablet or onto a smartphone as well. When I'm on my Mac, I use Lightroom, and Lightroom goes through and allows me all kinds of different controls in there as far as exposure or contrast, the highlights and shadows. I can play with that, which I usually do a lot. I'm of the idea that we capture everything, but we don't see everything, and these apps allow us to go through and maybe pull some of that out a little bit better. This is one of the main reasons that I ride, besides the travel itself, but it's also documenting it. It's something that I love to do, and I hope that's pretty obvious, okay? So that's it for this episode of UTADV. I promise the next episode we'll get into packing, all right? Thanks for watching.